and we're holding in the Maimah of Anoichi of right at the beginning of Ain Beis in the Ain Beis, and that was the Maimah of Shabbos Teshuvah. And we're holding towards the last os of that Maimah on Omud Tov Reish Samach, and we reached the Kitzur of Omud of Ois Shin Kof Beis. So I think what we'll do, we'll learn briefly the Kitzur, and that will then enable us to catch in on the main themes, and we'll be able to go ahead with the new art. And we were learning in general since the beginning of this volume the four inyonim, Claudium, Makifim Esko, Briavus, Eda Ishtalshalas, and they are Gila Helem, Yesh Mei Ayin, Etem V'Hishpastas, V'Koyach V'Poyal. We went through Gila Mina Helem and Yesh Mei Ayin, and in some detail Etem V'Hishpastas. We also completed in Ois Shin Kof Beis the Bio B'Negeh to Koyach V'Poyal. And we're now about to sum up how they interrelate, all these four key influences and factors, how they interrelate one to the other. So he says in the Kitzur, about 2/3 of the way down the page on Tov Reish Samach, but Koyach U'Poyal Ua Koyach Lifeil Behizgalas. Koyach U'Poyal is that you have a potential general ruchnistic koyach, and the poyel is the inyan of lifoil, something as it were chutz mi etzem hakoyach, chutz mi etzem ha'odam, to be poyel behis galas. And that's one of the klolim b'negeh to a pa'ula, that inyone is legales or lifoil, Miloshin, to, as it were, act in something which is beyond and separate from the Mokia itself. So therefore the Koyach is a all-inclusive, ruchnistic state, which its Indian, however, is to bring to Pa'ulas and to be Poyel in Yoni Ha'il and Bizgalas. So he says, Kamoy Koyach HaTanua Lahaniya, like the general spiritual power of the ability to move and to bring to movement, its Inyan is lahaniya, to move something, either through causing the Eivorim to move, then that koya, or that, as it were, reveal aspect from the koyach hatanua, then is poyel further into a dover gashmi, and that causes the uniform movement in the Dover Gashni, apart from the fact that the actual Ava itself moves. And so the Rebbe said the power to just make the Ava move, that's shy to the actual Koyach, the potential power of the Koyach HaTznua. Specific inyonim, which relate already to specific Eivorim, like the Etzbois, for example, in a Malocha, or the arms in general, or the movement of the feet and so on, those movements are already specific koiches and specific activities of the general koich, and they're like the union of pu'ulas bifnei atzmam compared to the general spiritual koyach. So that's what he said. Generally, koyach atnua inyoni is lahaniya, v'yish b'zeh guva madrega. Ve'enu k'moi gilui me'ahelem. It's not like the concept that we learned right at the beginning of this volume, which was gilui me'ahelem, she'arei ha'pa'ula ye'agashmias lo yesh b'koyach ha'poyel. The actual pula gashmias, the cause and effect, cause some power of change in a dover gashmi mamish, well, that doesn't exist in the actual koyach ha'tnua. It's not there in the actual koyach which brings to the poyel. He said, "V'gam ha'tnuas protias shenikoim gamkein pu'ulas," like we pointed out, they are compared to the general withdrawn power of koyach of the tnua. Those specific tnuot are already called pulas because they are already movements of a volume and a certain effect outside the actual koyach ha'pula itself, and they are like a midpoint to actually bring a change or a pu'ula mamoshias in a dover gashmi. So they're also called pu'ulas. So those pu'ulas, lo yesh b'metziasom b'koyach ha'tnua. They don't actually exist in their way they are, in the way they become a metzias of a given movement in the actual koyach ha'tnua. V'lochein ha'tnuas ein b'li gvul. Hein ba'echas v'hein b'kamet. We saw since the koyach ha'pula is muvdal legamri from any specific movement, then in that regard it's like a state which produces these movements ad bli gvul. Ein kol dover shemonea, like if you were to stop eating cholila, or if there's some severe illness in the ava which causes it not to move, but those inyanim she'etim lakal, and so we saw that those pu'ulas are not there. They're not just a whole collection inside the actual koyach ha'tnua. V'lochein ha'tnuas ein b'li gvul, whether it be in their quality and their ruchnistika toichan, or whether in the kamas, that is the actual number of movements that any ava or given a volume under a certain general roof in the koyach ha'tnua can produce. Ve'enu mizdama, so in that regard it's not really similar to gilui me'ahelem. Ve'enu mizdama gein kain lehiyuli v'gilui. We tried to compare it. It seems to have a close comparison to hiyuli and gilui, and we said it's not similar. Shaharei ha-giluim boim b'terach mamela. The giluim from the koyach ha'tnua ha'klodius, they come in and even from me'ileihem. They just happen. If there's a rotzen for them, then they just happen b'li kol yagir, and the koyach ha'tnua just produces them b'terach mamela. Ve'im miyosem b'chinas matzias. If they're a matzias, and they come out in a specific entity, then there should be some effort made on the part of the koyach ha'tnua to produce this specific inyan which comes a matzias of a given movement in the physical world. Just like we see that in the koyach ha'maskil, in order to produce new siklium, then there has to be a ishtadlus and a gear afila to produce these inyonim. Yet nonetheless, by the koyach ha'tnua, we see that the giluim, they come b'derech mamela. Even though they are a matzias, ein ze k'moi matzias ha'siklium, because every cycle is a very carefully defined dover mudal me'asheni. Mashim, we saw by the tnuas, they are not in even tremendously specific, nor they all are like in their general mahus. They're all similar, the one to the other, in that they're just movements of a volume. Masha'en, each cycle is a whole world with a whole pnimis with hitenis bifnei atzmei. Therefore, by Yuli to its Giluim, which is the classical example, is the Koyach HaMaskil, therefore it's only with Yegiya, wherever, that you can produce the Siklim. Mashinga, that's not the case by Koyach Upoya. ואם יש מבחינת מציאס, אין זה כמו מציאס הסיכלים, כי אם מציאס פשוטה. We said that they're takar matiz, but they're just a movement, and even though they may be repeated or have a certain similarity one to the other, they're just a matzias pshuta, but not a tremendously complex, interbuilt situation of a matzias like a seichel is. Or mikol mokim harizeh beginning matzias. Nonetheless, it is a form of matzias. And why should it be, even for Mamela, if everything which is a specific, aimed and based specifically has to have the inyan of Yigia? He said, Vegam, he said, Atnuis bekavona, I feel Atnuis that they come bekavona, we saw that can be, that certain Tnuis are very muchuvonim, yes, Tzvikim limud, and you need to teach the body to get used to doing those particular things. They, even at the beginning, they need a certain kavona, nish mamish b'derek yagiya, but a certain kavona and a certain action on the part of the person to become accustomed to doing those things. But once his Evorim become accustomed to doing those inyonim, then afterwards it can just go b'derech mamela. So therefore, the Giluim Beklal, even though there are Matthias Dover, or from Koyach Lapel, they can't be prepared to a Seichel from the Koyach Yuli or the Koyach HaMaskil, because they're not in that type of oifen, even though there are Matthias. Yet therefore, since there are Inyan Poshut, and they have all a certain inner similarity one to the other, therefore they come b'derech mamela, even one that needs careful attention, but it can become later also choizer l'derech mamela. Mashenkin b'hiuli gilui, well that's by hiuli v'gilui, we pointed out that no matter how much you're practiced, every time you need to bring about a gilui of a certain seichel, you need to concentrate carefully and be involved in that with a certain yigiyah and a certain very carefully struggled kavona in the inyan. Mashahin by koyach upoel, it never reaches that type of level even by dvarim mechuvonim. So he says, Zehu midnei shekoyach hatznua muchen lahaniyu. So we saw that the only way we could explain what was to say that the Koyach HaTznua, even though it's similar in a way to Ahiyuli, or it's not Mamish Ahiyuli, and we have to say that it's different in the sense that Hashem made it Malachatchila, that it's Korev, and Muchan to the Inyan of the Tnuis, that there's a kiru between the Koyach HaTznua HaKlolias and all the different Tnuis that come from it. They have a certain kiruv and similarity one to the other, in that the Koyach HaTznua was made by Hashem to produce davke this type of inyan. Mashinkin hiyuli gam Koyach HaMaskil achanosei right b'klos. It's just that it's ready by even klori to produce siklim liyes b'chinas mokia. Aval ein muchen la giloi, or it's not muchen to the type of giloi that it gives. Adarabah mushlal mimeno. We learned in detail that the Koyach HaMaskil is moved al mushlal from all the siklium that it produces. Therefore, the gilui is in the form of a ischadshus dover legabi the Koyach HaYuli, and also davki b'yagia. They are very specific and therefore demanding type of Matthias, which is not the case in the Tnuis that the Yad and the other Evorim carry out. They're all simple inyanim, which we call movements, but they're not any particularly highly identified Indian separating one from the other. So therefore it's not shaykh to be madame to hiyuli v'gilui memeno. So he says, v'yesh litmoi say yoser la'etzem v'yish pashtas. So the Rebbe said, let's go back now to the concept of etzem v'yish pashtas, and it's more, says the Rebbe, leaning to be madame koyach v'poyol and tnua and the tnuas which are nimtoi mimeno, to the concept of etzem v'yish pashtas. Why? Sha'yish pashtas u kamoi ha'etzem. In other words, just like the tnuas are like the koyach ha'tnu because it's korev lahem, in the same way, the Indian of a oyer, which is nimshach, from a moya b'derech his pashtas, is also kamoya etzem. Ubo b'derech mamela, and it also comes not b'derech yegia, but b'derech mamela. It's something that the etzem just gives out without yegia mitzadoi. Kamoy kain begilei atnuis sheboim b'derech mamela, ukamoya etzem b'plinas bligvo. Just like the etzem is bligvo, so the koyach hatanua can also come in or even from bligvo. So the Rebbe says, however, it's not a completely accurate comparison to etzem v'ishpashtas. Omnom he said, imi yeshem is damim b'zeh sheboim b'derech mamela. In that regard, etzem v'ishpashtas and koyach poyol v'atnu, koyach hatnu, poyol mimeno, he said they can be compared in that particular inyan that they come b'derech mamela. He said, einom mizdamim b'siba sador. Or if you go to the shorish and the reason for the inyan which causes them to be that way, then they're very different. He said, the be'etzem v'ishpashtas sheboa ishpashtas b'derech mamela, yeah, einochanami, u'mipnei sha'ishpashtas hi kamoya etzem, mami. She'enu v'chinas matzias dover klal. He said the reason that the etzem and ishpashtas come b'derech, the ishpashtas come b'derech mamela from the etzem is because the ishpashtas is mamish like the etzem, loshen alter Rebbe me'ein hamoya, and therefore she'enu v'chinas matzias dover, the oyer hameya is a ha'ora ba'alma. It's also not a matzias dover, just like the moya, it's always not a matzias dover. So in that regard, the Indian of koyach poyel is not accurately to be compared to etzem v'ishpashtas. She'enu b'chinas matzias dover klal, v'ainu shu oyer poshet k'moi ha'etzem. In other words, just like the etzem is a inyan poshet b'tachlis akshitas, so the ishpashtas are meya mimeno. Ma'ashenkin b'gilui hatnuis einu kain, sharei ha'gilui hatnuis hein lifel dover. Their holiness be poil something in the world around them or in the matzias around them, so their inyan la poil dover, they're nimshach in an even specific. Ma'ashein kein ha'ishpashtas min ha'etzem she'ein lifoil. Ha'ishpashtas min ha'etzem is not nimshach b'kavona lifoil is a dover. Now, like we say that the Yerasiviv l'mayla Kol inyonai is only legalis as etzem, just to be megala the etzem, and that's what we called earlier in the mind of the Yerasiviv Kol Almin, that's the immediate inyan of Oyer HaMishpashet me'amoya, as ein inyona lifel shum dover. No, its inyan is just berotzen ha'atzmas. He wanted that it should be mishgala, and so its gilu is not even from. Albeit even from Mamela, but it's k'moi ha'etzem. As him kain, behecher shu b'bchinas matzias dover. Shein alifo. Ve'im kain meaning the koyach upoyo, going back now to Tnua and koyach HaTnua and the poyo mimenu, ve'chreach shu b'chinas metzias dova. Ve'gam bo lepu'ula mamoshias dainu shabo yeba hakshoma. That also the poyo, which is nimsha from the koyach poyo ruchni atzmi, it comes in a way that it acts and causes in the gashmistic world a specific inyan. Shebo b'hakshoma, it comes in a form of close to gashmias. In other words, it somehow or another relates to the Olam HaGashmi. He said, Raksha ino nitfes b'chinas matzias mugval o proti kamoya siklim haprotim. In other words, even though there's a pu'ula mamoshias on the part of Koyach HaPoyo, however, he says it's not to be compared to Hiuli, because the Dover HaMetzius are specific, which is nimshach for the Hiuli, is a Dover Mugbal Mamish, with all of its inyonim, which are Magvil, even Ikari, or that's Ego from another one. Mashiach, as we pointed out in the Inif and the Pe'ulas, even though they come also in a form of Metzias Dover, or nonetheless they come b'derech Mamela and not b'derech Hamtzoa, b'derech Koyach, like the Hiuli. He said, V'ein hefresh b'vachusa Tnuas, in the etzem makeup of the etzem Tnuas themselves, that they're movements of the body, in that inyan, ve'etzem mahusa no shebo b'tziyo malacha zu, oy malacha acheres, chulu kenal. Meaning that the etzem tnuis, whether it's doing this inyan or the other inyan, are all similar one to the other, and they all have a certain gimian hadodi, like a mutual comparison, in the fact that they're simple movements of the body and of its ivorim. Mashen came the inyan of the sikliim, which come out of the koyach hayuli, of the koyach hamaskil. They are very specific, inyanim tremendously defined, one and the other, and they can't be confused, or they don't lend themselves to any confusion with another inyan, and therefore they come to Avki B'derech Hamtzoa V'Yagia. Since there's no really hefresh by the Koyach HaTnuas, even though they come by Metzias Dover, it's not the emesa inyan for Metzias Dover. The Sibas Adover Shebo Mamela U'Minei Koyach HaTnua Kvar Muchan Lazeh. The reason they come in that form of Mamela, because the Koyach HaTnua, as we pointed out in the teretz in the last ois, when we were dealing with certain questions, but I get to Koyach HaPoyo, and we said that the inyan for Koyach HaPoyo is Koriv, and it was made melachatchila from Hashem in a way that's muchen lahaniya, b'gilui, and therefore it follows in a way of mamela, even though they come into a form of matzias, a specific form of matzias, but nonetheless it's not as a matzias, a medias, muvdelas betachlis mi matzias acheres, and therefore it doesn't demand the inyan of yagia ve'yishtadlet. שבו ממילא הוא מפני שכוח התנועה כבר מוכן לזה להניע בגילוי. ואם כן, הרי בו מבחינת איסחדשס, יסף מכמו האיסחדשס, האיספשטס מן העצם, ליסף בו מבחינת מציאס דובר. Therefore, it's much more of a ischadshus than the ischadshus of a ispashtus. Min ha'etzem, could ispashtus min ha'etzem is kamoya ha'etzem, and it's einu metzias dova, and it's meya mamish beligvul in a form that it's einu metzias klal. Mashin kain these inyonim, even though they have a certain inner similarity one to the other, nonetheless they are a form of a metzias. And therefore they're much more of a Matthias, and therefore they demand the inif and Yigir much more when I say the not the inyan from Yigia, that's by Yuli. Therefore, they're more of a ischadja, even though they're not amitius ischadjas, or they are a form of ischadjas more than more than etzem ve'ispashtas. And therefore he says, Arei bo b'chinas ischadjas yoisa mi'mechoya ischadjas to ispashtas min ha'etzem. Liyoisa bo b'chinas matzias dover. Da koyach hatznua im yoisa hu muchan lahaniya Arei Ain Beis matzias hatznua. As we pointed out, it's not just a collection of all the different forms of movements that can be made inside the koyach hatznua haklodis. The gilui hatznua sheboim b'chinas matzia. Each of the tnuas comes in a form of a definable matzias in the world. Harizeh b'chinas ischadshas yoisa. That's more of a ischadshas than what the hashpashtas min ha'etzem. U'kamaikein masheboim b'chinas bli gvul canal. Whatever we saw, there's no gvul to the inyan of how many movements can be made ka'od sha'odam hu chai v'kayom, that what they come in the form of bli gvul, ein ze k'moi b'ispashtas min ha'etzem she'ispashtas u'b'chinas bli gvul. The point over there is that the ispashtas itself, in its own self, is bli gvul. Since it's k'moya moya and it's meya mina moya, that just like the moya is bli gvul, so it's also the ha'ora mimena, which is called ispashtas, is also bli gvul in its very self. Ma'ashenkin begilei atnuas, even we say that's also bli gvul, it's not that each tenua is bli gvul in itself. Hari kol tenua u mugbelet. Each tenua is a dover mugbal. It's just that mitzad the etzem koyach tenua, they can just go ad bli gvul. But not that they're bli gvul amiti. Each one is movable from the atzmai. That just they could be nimshal by even shal bli gvul. V'im kein harazeh kamo yesh mi'ayin. That's got a certain similarity, if anything, to yesh mi'ayin. Over there also we saw that the bli gvul mitzad ha'ayin ha'mahaveh, that can produce dvarim mugbalim specifiim ad bli gvul. But each inyan is a yesh and a mugbal b'fnei atzmai. Just that the ayin ha'mahaveh, being as he is emes elokus, he can produce inyonim ad ein shiur. Yehu mitzad ha'ayin ha'mahaveh. Aber Misaveh u Bagbola. Genau, Perek Shin Kofala, that we saw in 2 Prochim ago. He made that point when he was talking about Yesh Mi'ayin. Rak Shebe Yesh Mi'ayin, Harei Ha'ayin Muvdo Mi'ayesh, Va'isaves u Be'ein Aroig Legamrei. Quite a number of prohim back we explained that the inyan of yesh mi'ayin is the emes inyan of Ain Beis. Absolutely, there's absolutely no error between the dover hamisaveh and the mahaveh. However, in koyach kamoi u'b'chinas koyach kamoi gilei atnuas mikoyach hamaniya. Ari koyach hatnua ha'atzmi kvar muchen lahaniya begiloi kanal. Perek Shin Kol Beis. Ve'im kein ein ze b'chinas avdolas ha'era kol kach. Since it's muchen lazeh and it has a certain readiness to produce inyonim of that nature ad ein gvul, then it's not like the inyan from the yesh mi'ayin, but also the machir produces dvarim ad bli gvul. Over there, it produces them in even that it's moved over tachlis avdola from the inyonim. And there, Ein Seif is only in the etzem koyach adamahaveh atzmai, and he's moved over tachlis ha'erach. Mashing came here, we've already made the point barucha that there's a certain preparedness and kiruv in the koyach hatznua haklodius legabi the tnuas mimeno. ומקום מוחים הוא בחינס איסחדשס. יש הגילויים בואים בהגבולה. Nonetheless, koyach u'poil does have a certain inyan of a similarity to Yesh Me'ayin in that it is Ischadches, what the Giluim, each of the inyonim comes in its own Hagbola. Umikol shein ba'pa'ula mamoshias shenitvas be'yesh. But that pa'ula is still a pa'ula ruknias, which is going to move things in the Gashmias. When it comes to the actual movement that it makes inside the Olam HaGashmi, well, that's a koshchein that it's already a dor hanitvas be'yesh, and in Matthias, because it's already a Matthias of a certain uftu and a certain achievement in the Olam HaGashmi. And so it's certainly an inyan for Ischadches, but it's not like the inyan for Ischadches Yesh Mi'ayin, but that's completely hevdel ha'erach legamri, and here it's a certain inyan of kirov hachona on the part of the koyach hatznua. V'hinei apulis b'poyo ainu kishakoyches protium poilim v'adovi. It's like we said, the koyches protium means the koyches ruchnium in the evorim protium from the koyach hatznua haklodi. Hainu kishakoyches protium poilim v'adovi yesh mamish. Harizeh b'chinas ischadches Gam legabi gilei hatnuos, even legabi those more specific gilei hatnuos in the yadayim or the whatever it is, that's already ischadches because it's a pa'ula in ador gashmi, she'in koyches ruchnim, va'apula hi gashmis, mikol mogim, v'yesh gilei hatnuos boim gamkein b'hagbola, who beginners metzias, they come also in the form of hagbola, and a metzias, ein ze beginners Richok kolkach, that's not in the form of richok, k'moya richok ayin mi'ayesh. Since they come, or in the form of tnuis, b'hagbola, and they come in a way of, however, of kirov, and they're nimshak, lifoyo, is a dover hazeh, and they actually are the koiches which move it and make it do that inyan, so they have already a certain readiness and a kirov to the pu'ula that they cause in the Gashmistic world. So even though it's a ischadches, it's not a emasa, ischadches. Mikomaham liyeshik giluim, shigilui atnuis boim gankein bagbola, ubachins metzias, ein zebachinas richo kolkach, kamoi richo ayin mi'yesh. Even though they're like source points, these tnuis, because they're koiches rukniim, and nimshochin leforet atnua hagashmias, or that gives them a certain nearness to the ischadches that they produce. Mashenkin in Yesh Me'an has a richo goma altogether from the pu'ula or the yesh, from the ayin altogether. And nimsa that you got like two kiruvim away from Kloli and away from Proti. You have a kiruv the koyach hatnua haklodias, and then you have a kiruv in the koyach hatnua haprotias, which is also called a koyach to a certain extent, which actually produces the dover gashmi, or they have a certain kiruv to the hishchadches, which they cause, not like Yesh Me'ayin, where there's a richo otzim v'goma from the dover that Yesh Me'ayin causes. All right, so he says, Lafise, we can now come close to summing up all the four different inyonim in a way that we'll be able to relate them and interrelate them one to the other in the form of two extremities and two like momotzoim between the two extremities that somehow or another cause a certain movement in the general bria of closeness between two differing factors of linking closer together than the two extremities. And therefore he says, well, moving, he said, v'nimtza, the beis ha'inyonim etzem v'hispashtas, v'koyachu poyo, hine etzem v'hispashtas korav yesa, le'inyan helem v'giloi, v'koyachu poyo korav yesa, le'in yesh v'ayin, v'hein madregas mumotzoim beinayim. And even though they're not similar, and they're not mamish the same thing, but we can find in them certain inyonim doimim v'krivim, one to the other. Just like when we began now in this chapter, we found a certain kira between the koyach ha'pu'ula ha'klodius and the proti tenuas v'chulu to the union of gilui ha'helem, in the sense that there's a certain dimion and a certain kira to the dover ha'nimshach compared to its mocher. However, we saw that over there, the drawing were mamish b'matzias in the helem, and here these inyonim, even though they have a certain kira, they're not b'matzias klau in the koyach ha'tenua ha'klodius. So therefore there is a certain similarity, but not an ultimate one. On moving the etzem v'ishpashtas, harizeh l'mayla b'madrega mi helem begiloi. So it follows a very interesting thing, that even though helem begiloi are going to be like the two extremity, one of the two extremities, helem begiloi. However, and the mamutza, which closer to it of all the other things, is going to be etzem. The ishpashtas, nonetheless, the truth is that etzem v'ishpashtas occurs on higher madregas than what helem begiloi do. Because we saw that helem begiloi, the Rabbi pointed out earlier in the previous oath, that the unif in helem begiloi is the abor v'efen pnimi, and it's already shy to the unif in ishtalshalas, or helem as the emizeh, because it's in yonim, but even in their helem, they have a certain matzias. And therefore the shy to ishtalshalas, which is not the case with etzem v'hispashtas. Etzem v'hispashtas is right back in the moya, and the oyer hameyim mimenu kegon sei v'kolamin, and sei v'kolamin is makif eskolo ilamas. That's the pshat sei v'kolamin. Therefore it follows that etzem v'hispashtas is really if we take madregas, then etzem v'hispashtas is really l'mayla mi helem v'giloi. So you got one extremity, and the dargamum it says alongside it, moving towards the middle, is really a higher madrega in etzem madregas than what it is. And then he says, but koyo hapuyo, and now the other way around on the other side. He said, and the unif and koyo hapuyo, which is now similar to yesh miyayin, it's like the mamutza. After yesh miyayin, that's lamata b'madrega mi yesh miyayin, because koyo hapuyo, there's already a certain nearness and readiness on the part of the koyo hapuyo to its inyonim, nimshochim mimeno. And therefore it can't be on the madrega of yesh miyayin, which is only b'kei haboyre mamish, and that's a koyach ha'atzmi, the cause the dover b'lein aroch klal b'li shum kirov, no other of a havdolah mimeno betachlis havdolah. And yet nonetheless there's a certain similarity in koyach ha'poyo, but moving that it's lamata mimadrega. Nimtza that the two dvarim kilo mumatzoim v'nimtzoim, between the two extremities, are different, one from the other, and in one case it's l'mayla in madrega harbe from its extremity, and in the other case the other way, that the dover hamutza yoter is lower madrega than its extremity. He said, Rakba Mendoson v'inyonom, it's only in their mido, in their characteristics, and their inyonim, ema madregas mumatzois, that we can find certain factors in these inyonim which make them, as it were, not as extreme cases as the two extreme cases. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily lower in madrega than the extreme cases. And therefore he says that they can be, as it were, different in madrega, as regards, and via the two extremities that they represent a middle point of. Moving to etzem ishpashtas harizeh l'mayla b'madrega v'koyach ha'poyo harizeh l'mata b'madrega miyesh miyayin. Rashi said in their midah, in their content and their aspect, in Yonom they have certain madregas Mumatzois legabe the two extremes. The Helem v'Giloi hu b'chinas Giloi mamish, avo ena b'chinas Yischadshus, bo b'chinas Agbola, and it comes in the form of Agbola. V'ainu she'ei Shiur, like we saw, that since the Helem v'Giloi already has in the Helem the Matthias of the Dover, which is later becomes Giloi, then that means that there's a Shiur vacates how much the actual Giloi can go. And after a while, it's going to be Nikla Koicha, like we pointed out already several times. However, Ain Beis, Ubchinas Ischachas Mamish, Ubchinas Bligvul. So Kumtais, that those are the two extremities, that they're also very different, one from the other. They're complete extremities. That's a inyan van Ain Beis Shum Ischachas, and that's a inyan van Ischachas Amitias, and in a form of Bligvul, like we said, Mitzad Mahavi, it can go Bligvul. Yeah, Mitzad Bechinas Ha'ayin, meaning the Mahavi. Yeah, Vamela Nimtza, that those are the two extremities. Avohu Bechinas Koyach Nelam, She'ena Bechinas Giloi Klal B'Hayesh, Adraba Mudom Himeno. In Giloi HaHelem, the Giloi is just a Giloi of the Helem and carries in it a very large extent of the actual Helem. Over here by the inyan of Yesh Mi'ayin, that's in Azar even, that the Yesh is Legamri Muvdol, and the Ayin remains a Dovan Le'elam Legamri from the Ayin Nimtza Mimeno. Yeah, okay, Nelam She'ena B'chinas Giloi Klal B'Hayesh Adraba Muvdal Mimeno. So those are the two great extremities. The Etzem v'Yispashtas Eina b'chinas Yischadshus Mamish V'loi b'chinas Giloi Me'ahelam. Etzem v'Yispashtas is sort of a middle point in the sense that it's not a Eina v'Yischadshus, so it's not like Yesh Mi'ayin, V'loi b'chinas Giloi Me'ahelam, but it's also not like Giloi Me'ahelam. Yeah, v'hu Giloi Oyer Mamish, Kamuya etzem, yeah, v'pinas Bligvul, and it's a inyan van Giloi of Oyer, which is very like the etzem, Me'ain ha'etzem, and therefore it's in its very essence of its own self, it's Bligvul. Harizeh mizdama yesa, if it's already mizdama to something, which is not mizdama very much to anything, but if it is, then it's mizdama yesa le'inyan Helem v'Giloi. In that rather sort of slightly hesitant or doubtful way, Etzem V'Yispashtas is like Giloi HaHelem in the sense that the Dov HaMishpashet, being as it is, Giloi Oyer, it's like the Etzem. So just like Giloi Min HaEtzem is also like the Etzem. Rashi B'Zeh, U'B'chinas Gvul, U'B'Zeh B'Ligvul. By Etzem Giloi Min HaHelem, like we said, it eventually can only lead to a certain limited extension. Mashenkin, in the case of Etzem V'Yispashtas, it's an inyan from Bligvul. He said, V'gam ha'Yischadshus, Eina b'chinas Yischadshus Mamish, by Etzem V'Yispashtas. He said, V'yesh efresh b'neihem sha'giloi me'ahelem eina b'chinas Yischadshus. That's not really a inyan van Yischadshus at all. Mevnei shenimsha b'matzias ye'kolo b'ahelem. U'b'etzem v'Yispashtas hare eina nimsa klal b'mkorei kanal. The shlilas ha'etzem me'ayispashtas yoyser. Gam mishlilas ha'yuli me'agiloi. It's completely moved on. Mashe'ena b'chinas, or Mashe'ena b'chinas Yischadshus, min Mashe'ena b'chinas Matzias. In Mikoma, the whole reason we say it's not Yischadshus Mamish is because it's not an inyan from Matzias. Oyer HaSeivir, l'mashal, is not a dover she'ish noi b'Matzias. Or Mikol Mokim, be'etzem, inyan mashu hu al kaponim, b'chinas Oyer, Yitachin b'zeh inyan Yischadshus. Nonetheless, we can call that a form of a Yischadshus, of oil. Lagabi moya is a sort of a form of ischatz. So it's not the emes oifen of ischatz, kemoi in the inyan of koyach mopoil and yesh min ha'ayin. It's a form of ischatz, of not really. So therefore, if there's any real dimion between them, it's more to the inyan from Helam v'Gilui. And he says, with the inyan from koyach mopoil, it's the other way around. If we want to find a more a direction, as it were, in which the koyach mopoil will be similar to Mashahu, then that will be to Yesh Mi'ayin more than it is to Gilui HaHelam, but also it won't be a complete and utter similarity, and yet nonetheless that similarity makes it and gives it the status of a form of a memutza between the two. And therefore he says, Koyach HaPoyel mizdami yoser la'ayin v'yesh, li'yesh zer le'poyel pe'ula gashmias. Just like yesh behind is also li'poyel pe'ula. Va'pe'ula hi b'chinas ischatches le'gabi Koyach HaPoyel, shehu ruchni. Yeah, it's also a form of ischatches, because that's a Koyach ruchni, and that's a Koyach mamoshi in the gashmistic world, ultimately. Gilui HaPu'ulis Protiyas, but they're also koiches. Imiyos and Sha'inam B'chinas Ischatzus Mamish, Mikomokim Leizim B'chinas Agbola, V'is Metzias Areize B'chinas Ischatzus. Yeah, that's also a form of Ischatzus, or Bo B'chinas Bligvo, Shemoi in Yesh Mi'ayin. And it's also a koich Nelam like Yesh Mi'ayin. Over Mela there's a certain Dimayoyin, and certain similarity to the inyan and yesh mi'ayin, and yet there's a certain chiruv there, even though it's a ischatzus, it's not a ischatzus mamish, and like we said, a certain chiruv and a hachona in the koiches of the poyo, in the koiches atnua, legabi the koiches and the pu'ulas mihem, and therefore there's a certain nearness, even though there are ischatzus. Mashenkin yesh mi'ayin, it's legamrei roho b'tachlis arich. And therefore, even though it's a mizdameh, it's not a complete mizdameh, and it's in the form of a what we might call a inner and middle state bilvad, and therefore we give it the term amamotza, even though kamuan, it's not the emes very carefully defined loshen mamutza that we have in other places than again to other factors and ideas altogether. He said, and therefore the tenuis beneged to the koiches apuyel mihem, they're also a infant koich nelam, raksha beklolas, upinas kiruv elapiula. Like we said, that those are the average made in the union of these koiches klodium to the pa'ulis, nimta mihem, v'loika me'ayin, shemuvdal minayes. So in that regard, they'd have no basic similarity whatsoever, even though in certain more general specificalities they do have a certain similarity. He said, v'gam nitvas, biha pa'ula. He said also, to a certain extent, the koyach hatznua hanimta, the oifen hagashmi does actually become nitvas somewhat in the pu'ula that it makes. V'hainu shezeu she'izgalas, he said, v'hainu shezeu b'izgalas, yeser min ha'ayin. The imi yeser b'chinas ha'helem, harei zeh mikomohim nira v'nigla yeser meb'chinas ha'ayin, yeser b'chinas kirov. Like we pointed out the whole time, that since it has a certain kirov, then it's an inyan which is more begiloi and more leaning towards the hischachas mimeno. Maskin yesh mi'ayin, there's no kirov b'klal, and that's a inyan von richok ha'erach and kvitzes ha'darges v'ifan nifla harbi yoysa. All right, so that's more or less the whole summing up of the Inyan. And now, just to complete the os briefly, he said, "B'klolas daled inyanim anal lamaila helam v'gilui." He said, what would that be in our knowledge of the giluim melamaila towards the Olamas? So he says that the Inyan of Gilui HaHelam is the Gilui of the Oya Shabov B'chinas Mida Ugvul. That's what he already said before, that's the Habo Beseda Yistalshalos of the Elamas, and therefore it's Beklal, the Oya which in its Inyan is Bo Mida Ugvul. Like we pointed out that it's Kol HaKoyhe Achreizman Masuya. Yeah, Etzem V'Ispashtas is in the Obligo. Like we said, that's shy to Seiv Kolamin. Ain Beis v'Koyach Upayol, he said, there's shy to the Inyan from Malchus, which is Mamti, the Olamas, Kilo even from Bria, Yesh Me'ayin. Over Kilo, there's two like nuances in Malchus itself, when I get to that. In other words, at first there's the etzem, very etzem koyach of Hamtzoah, but there yesh me'ayin b'malchus, and that's the Inyan from Pnimis HaMalchus, which is l'mayla me'aparsa. That's the etzem koyach ha'atzmas, which is found in Malchus, and that's l'mayla me'ayin ha'mavdil bein Malchus le'elam as biyah. Therefore he said that's the etzem koyach of Malchus, l'havas yesh me'ayin, הוא בחינה מלכוס של המעלה מהפרסה, שזהו בחינס הבדולה מהיד. That's the etzem hisnasas, and Havdalah of the malchus from the yet. He said, "V'koyach hu poyach hu b'chinas hamalchus k'moy shulacha haparsa." That's the Inyan, like it's mavur b'kol ha'mekaimas, that malchus has also a certain trace of kiru to the nivroim. However, that's liacha, the Inyan of the parsa. That's how it's already shaykh to the Inyan from Nasa Kesel Abiyah, and even more than that. That's already shaykh to Elamas Mamish. However, it's still a little bit beyond them, and that's the Inyan of the Koyach HaTnua HaKlodius, or the Koyach HaTnua HaProtius. Zebchinas Kiru, Yesa Elayesh. The Alkein, Ubchinas Gilui, Ainu Shenira Venigle Koicho Biaha Peulas. Ukamaishi is Boya. Bez Hashem, as will be dealt with in more detail in the coming ois and in further oises. And in the coming ois we're going to deal with all these inyonim, how they come out in Aveda Papuya, and how we can see that they are Nimshalamata Baveda Sa'odam, or even shall avoid be inyoni ha'odam lamata. Okay, so listen, guys, can you guys in Kwachabad hear me? Hello? Moshe?
Yeah, we hear you fine.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you very well.
Because I can't see you. I can see everybody else, but I can't see you guys. But
we see you and we hear you.
Right. So listen, I want to just discuss briefly with you guys a certain Inyan, and that is that on the Monday evening after Shavuos, let's say Shavuos is Sunday, and Monday is Yisro Chag. Shavuos is on that evening in